A single contract for a young boy could be purchased for several hundred ounces of silver, but the true price was paid in a fate worse than any termination. This is the hidden story of the Xiang Gong, the honorable gentlemen of Qing dynasty China, whose lives were not sold, but perfectly engineered, from their diets to their poetry. Their gilded cages hid the meticulous accounting of human chattel. The Gilded Cage, a taxonomy of shadow. In 18th and 19th century China, male pleasure houses, or xianggong guan, occupied a unique, almost celebrated niche, particularly in major cities like Beijing and Suzhou. These establishments were not simply places of commerce, they were elaborate stages for a specific cultural performance. Beijing's brothels, often nestled in the famous Bada Hutong district, specialized in the artistic and theatrical, catering to high-ranking officials and wealthy scholars. Suzhou's counterparts were renowned for their exquisite taste and delicate young men. This was a formal, structured industry. The initial step into this life was often the cruelest coincidence of all: economic desperation. Most of these young men, typically between the ages of 12 and 16 upon entry, were not willing participants. They were the victims of devastating famine, crushing poverty, or the callous decisions of parents who sold their children as a final, desperate act of survival for the rest of the family. The other major source was the clandestine trade of kidnapping, where the appearance of a particularly comely youth sealed his fate. The house's owner, the ayi or mama, auntie or mother, would pay a negotiated, often minuscule sum for a boy, immediately transferring ownership and all legal rights to the house. The contract they signed was a bill of sale. Upon arriving at the establishment, the boy was immediately bathed in the illusion of luxury. The establishments themselves were often resplendent: courtyards with flowing water, rooms adorned with intricately carved furniture, fine silks draping the doorways, and the lingering scent of sandalwood and expensive perfume. Patrons arriving were greeted not by the crude reality, but by the performance. This was the deceptive glamour of the Xianggong life. The young men were dressed in exquisite robes, their faces carefully prepared, their mannerisms rehearsed to perfection. It was a calculated contrast. The sumptuous surroundings were meant to entice the elite, masking the cold, brutal truth that beneath the silk, the boy was nothing more than a slave, his entire existence reduced to a unit of profit. The training was about systematic erasure, transforming a youth into a highly polished commodity. The path the boys trod was a stark, brutal testament to exploitation. They went from being sons to chattel, their future determined not by their dreams, but by the price the house could command for an hour of their time. The next step was the forging of that commodity, a meticulous, painful process designed to elevate their market value. The ritual of beauty, forging the commodity. If your brain isn't already doing a backflip, consider the sheer specificity of the transformation these young men underwent. This was an exacting process of physical and psychological alteration, systematically erasing the raw edges of boyhood to forge a stylized object of desire. It was the imposition of a ritual so precise it mirrored the refinement of a rare metal. The initial, immediate requirement was the cultivation of extreme effeminate beauty. Every detail of their physical appearance was strictly controlled. They were held to rigid diets, often intentionally sparse to maintain a delicate, slender figure. Heavy physical labor was forbidden, lest it spoil the desired graceful form. Their hair was styled and cared for meticulously, their skin treated with expensive lotions to achieve a porcelain-like paleness. The Qing aesthetic for Xianggong favored a look of soft vulnerability, a blend of youthful innocence and cultivated sophistication. Makeup, applied by the ayi or a senior boy, was mandatory, used to soften their features and emphasize their large, dark eyes. The transformation extended far beyond the visual. To justify the high price commanded by the establishment, the young men had to be masters of the arts. The primary skill was singing, specifically the demanding, elegant style of kung quopra. Hours were spent daily practicing vocal techniques, mastering the intricate movements, and memorizing long, poetic librettos. They were also rigorously trained in calligraphy, poetry composition, classical music, and the complex rules of social etiquette required to entertain high-ranking officials. A successful Xianggong had to seamlessly transition from pouring wine to reciting a classical poem or offering philosophical counsel. This intense training served two purposes. The initial one, it inflated the boy's monetary value. The more refined the art, the higher the price. The final, and more insidious purpose, was a tool of psychological control. By forcing them to adopt a hyper-feminine, artistic persona, the system systematically stripped away their original identity and conditioned them to view their bodies and talents purely as a transaction. The stage became their entire world, and their true self was relegated to a prisoner within it. The discipline was severe. Mistakes in performance or appearance were met with immediate, harsh physical discipline from the IE or her enforcers. Ask yourself, what kind of society creates beauty by breaking bones? The rigorous standards of beauty and artistic performance ensured the commodity remained polished and profitable. This systematic erasure, disguised as refinement, solidified their status. Beautiful boys, trapped in a relentless, unforgiving spotlight. The Honorable Gentleman, a name built on deception. The grand irony woven into the very fabric of this system was the title itself, Xianggong, which translates to Honorable Gentleman. This label was a masterpiece of rhetorical deception, designed to elevate the status of the practice and, crucially, to maintain the self-respect of the elite patrons. The clients, scholars, members of the bureaucracy, imperial officials, and powerful merchants did not see themselves as common customers. They saw themselves as patrons of the arts and connoisseurs of refinement. By calling the young men honorable gentlemen, the patrons could frame their visits as sophisticated intellectual outings rather than purely commercial transactions. This provided a crucial shield of respectability in a society obsessed with status. The relationship was often romanticized, drawing on classical Chinese tales of profound male friendship. This romanticized view was supported by a specific cultural argument. During times of national mourning, or when officials were performing rituals that required ritual purity, contact with women was restricted or deemed spiritually polluting. Male companionship, therefore, became a culturally sanctioned, purer alternative, a philosophical distinction used to justify the practice at the highest levels of Qing society. It was considered an appreciation of an elevated form of beauty that transcended the crudity of carnal desire, a belief that made the brothels a commonplace feature of elite social life. The patrons used the Xianggong as companions for drinking, composing poetry, and intellectual debate. For a brief, fleeting moment, the young man was treated as an equal, a muse, a friend. He sat at the feast, participated in the discussion, and often performed a piece of music or opera. This temporary elevation was part of the transactional performance. It created a powerful emotional hook, making the patron feel like a benevolent protector while ensuring the Xianggong remained hopeful that genuine patronage might free him. If you find this historical pattern of exploitation as chilling as we do, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to uncover the forgotten narratives buried in history's shadow. But this temporary equality masked the absolute power imbalance. The moment the patron grew tired, the illusion evaporated. The boy could be dismissed, mistreated, or worse, transferred to a lower-tier brothel, or sold to a less refined, more abusive client. The honor in his title was entirely dependent on the whim and continued patronage of his client. The high-minded rhetoric was a thin veneer over the brutal economic exploitation taking place in the back rooms. This system ensured that the boy himself was never truly viewed as a human being, but as a temporary, replaceable commodity dressed in the clothes of an honorable gentleman. Does a title mean anything when your life is owned? The true chains, as we shall see, were forged in silver. The contract and the chain, anatomy of debt. The parallels aren't just similar, they are surgically precise when you examine the financial architecture of the brothel system. Just as the creators of the Titanic ensured a legally compliant yet morally bankrupt shortage of lifeboats, the brothels ensured a financially compliant yet brutally inescapable shortage of freedom. The bondage was constructed using the meticulous details of debt. When the IE purchased the boy, she assigned a purchase price, often consisting of several hundred ounces of silver. This was the boy's initial debt to the house. The contract, sometimes for a fixed period of 8 or 10 years, stated that he was free upon completion of the term or upon repayment of the debt. The latter clause was the true chain, a masterpiece of economic entrapment. The IE immediately began inflating the account. Every expense, food, lodgings, the expensive robes, the makeup, the opera lessons, the medicinal teas was meticulously recorded and charged back to the young man's debt. The interest rate on this debt was astronomical, ensuring that every month the cost of living outpaced the income generated by the boy's services. The price the patron paid was split, often with only a tiny, fractional amount credited toward the principal debt, while the vast majority went to the IE and the operating costs. This financial mechanism created a life sentence of economic servitude. Even the most successful Xianggong, one who generated significant income, found his debt only marginally reduced, or sometimes actually increasing. The house had no financial incentive to see the young man freed. His greatest value was derived from his youth and beauty, and once those faded, the house would merely sell the remaining debt and the young man to a less prestigious establishment or a private collector. This system was an accounting marvel of exploitation. It allowed the IE to maintain the pretense of legality. The young man was not a slave. Technically, he was merely fulfilling a labor contract to repay a loan. Yet, in reality, the contract was a cage, calculated to ensure that, short of a miracle, the young man would never earn enough to purchase his own liberty. It was a vicious cycle where every new robe and every elegant meal served only to tighten the financial chain around his neck. Was there ever a system more perfectly engineered for inescapable suffering? The silver coins that crossed the table represented a debt that only the grave could truly forgive. The Knight's Theatre, performing intimacy. The Xianggong brothel was the Qing dynasty's most complex, demanding, and utterly exhausting theatrical venue, where the performance of intimacy was often far more valuable than the service itself. This was the true skill that commanded the highest price: the ability to make the patron feel genuinely cared for, appreciated, and understood. When a high official called for a Xianggong, the process was a carefully managed production. The boy would arrive, exquisitely dressed and prepared, and his evening would begin not with physical closeness, but with hours of intense social engagement. This was required emotional labor. The patron, often weary from the cutthroat world of the imperial court, was seeking escape. He wanted a partner who would listen without judgment, offer intelligent conversation, and soothe his troubled mind. The young man was expected to be a master chameleon, a poet when the patron was introspective, a witty companion when the patron wished to drink and gamble, and a quiet, attentive presence when the official simply wished to vent his frustrations. They would often share a glass of warm wine, compose stanzas of poetry together, or attend an opera. This deep social bond, often lasting for many hours into the night, built a facade of genuine affection. The power of this performance was its ability to create a pattern of emotional attachment. The patron began to feel a possessive fondness for the young man, viewing him as a rare, refined object. This was essential for the house's business model, as it encouraged the client to return repeatedly and to spend more lavishly on gifts. The boys themselves were trained to cultivate this attachment, walking a razor-thin line between authentic connection and manipulative emotional engagement. For the Xianggong, the performance of feeling was a survival mechanism. He had to be entirely present, attentive to every nuance of the patron's mood, while simultaneously remaining utterly detached. This constant emotional masking was a source of profound psychological trauma. He was selling not just his body, but his presence, his intellect, and his ability to simulate affection. The moments of physical service were only a fraction of the grueling night, which ended with the patron's satisfied departure and the boy's immediate preparation for the next shift. How does one survive selling the very essence of their presence? The Knight's Theatre was a smooth narrative of false friendship, demanding a performance that left the actor hollowed out. The scars of the trade, violence and disease life, sometimes writes fiction that is far stranger and more horrifying than anything a novelist could invent. The illusion of silk and poetry quickly gives way to a grim reality where physical decay and psychological damage were certainties. Peel back the surface of the gilded cage, and you find pervasive violence. The constant threat of physical punishment was an integral part of maintaining discipline and profitability. The IE and the house enforcers were quick to deliver brutal beatings for perceived infractions. This violence was systematic, designed to break the will of the young man and reinforce his utter subservience to the house. The welts and scars were routinely covered with makeup and expensive robes, hidden from the public gaze. The patrons themselves were another source of danger, While some were gentle and attentive, others were prone to fits of explosive temper, especially under the influence of alcohol. The boys were expected to endure mistreatment without complaint, as refusal to satisfy a client, no matter how abusive, could result in severe punishment from the house. This left the young men in a perpetual state of anxiety, constantly anticipating the next blow. The danger was not only physical but internal. The spread of contagious illnesses was a constant, terrifying reality. With no understanding of modern sanitation or disease transmission, the working life was a fast track to physical decline. The boys who fell ill were a liability to the house. They were either aggressively treated with rudimentary and often painful traditional medicines, or neglected and isolated to prevent the contamination of the more profitable young men. For those who contracted incurable conditions, their value plummeted instantly. They were often quietly sold off, discarded, or moved to a back room to perform menial tasks until they weakened completely. The psychological injury was just as devastating. The forced isolation, the compulsory performance of an identity that was not their own, and the constant fear created profound long-term damage. These young men suffered from persistent terror, learned helplessness, and a shattered sense of self. The beauty and the talent were simply tools used to accelerate their consumption. The story is a stark, brutal reminder that some coincidences are not just curious statistical oddities, but fatalistic threads connecting a life of forced elegance to a lifetime of internal suffering. The unspoken code, rivalry and hierarchy. The rigid hierarchy within the brothels was a high-stakes, internal ecosystem where the success of one meant the immediate suppression of another. This system was meticulously maintained by the IE to maximize profits and ensure the boys remained focused on external validation rather than internal solidarity. At the very top were the top boys, or the huatu, flowerhead. These were the most beautiful, artistically skilled, and highly sought-after young men, often aged 14 to 18. They enjoyed relative privilege, better food, more luxurious clothing, and access to the IE's personal protection. Their value was astronomical, and their existence was an open symbol of the house's prestige. They typically entertained the wealthiest and most influential officials. Their position was perpetually precarious, reliant entirely on the fickle nature of the market and the quick fade of youthful looks. The vast majority comprised the middle ranks, striving daily to secure a wealthy, consistent patron. Below them were the young men who were past their physical peak or who failed to master the artistic skills, the failures. Their duties often shifted from artistic performance to general servitude, cleaning, or performing less desirable tasks for the house. Their income dropped dramatically and their debt ballooned, pushing them closer to being sold off. The competition was fierce and deliberately encouraged. The IE fostered an atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry, knowing that internal conflict prevented the young men from uniting or challenging her authority. The boys would compete fiercely for the attention of a rich official, knowing that a successful night could mean a temporary reprieve from punishment or a small gift of silver. Stories from the era suggest patterns of internal sabotage ruining a competitor's makeup, whispering rumors to a patron, or intentionally spoiling a rival's opera performance. This constant pattern of internal struggle meant that the young men, despite their shared circumstance, rarely formed the bonds necessary for resistance or escape. The reward for success was fleeting, but the punishment for failure, demotion, isolation, or violence was immediate and absolute. If success only means temporary safety, what does life truly offer? Their lives were a zero-sum game played on the house's terms, where the luxury of the top boy was merely a temporary postponement of the inevitable tragic decline. Patronage and protection, the fatal hook. The life of a Shandong was defined by a single desperate hope, the fatal hook of permanent patronage. This was the legendary, 1 in 1,000 chance that a patron would be so moved by affection or possessiveness that he would purchase the boy's freedom. This act was known as Shu Shen, redeeming the body. The system was brilliantly designed to leverage this hope. The patron would first have to negotiate the buyout price with the IE. Given the boy's accumulated debt, interest, and the house's expected future profits, this price was deliberately exorbitant, often equivalent to the cost of a small estate. The IE would reluctantly agree, ensuring the transaction appeared to be a genuine act of sacrifice and love on the part of the patron. For the young man, this was a sudden, dramatic shift in fortune. He left the brothel for a life under the exclusive protection of a single man. The coincidence here is that the redemption was rarely true liberation. In almost every case, the Xianggong merely exchanged one master for another. He would become the patron's concubine, subordinate, or personal companion, his legal status only slightly elevated. He was still dependent on the patron's continued favor for his survival, his status, and his security. This new life carried its own set of lethal risks. If the patron was already married, the boy faced the jealousy and possible physical abuse of the wife and other concubines. If the patron's fortunes changed, if he lost his official position or his wealth, the boy's protection would vanish instantly. Historical accounts show redeemed Xianggong being summarily abandoned or returned to a low-tier house if their patron grew weary, ensuring a final, devastating fall from grace. The entire process of redemption, while offering a dramatic exit from the brothel, merely introduced a new pattern of precarious dependency. The ultimate irony of the fatal hook was its timing. The redemption had to happen while the boy was at the height of his beauty. Once the bloom was off, the patron's interest waned, the price dropped, and the window of opportunity slammed shut, leaving the young man to face the predictable fate of the unredeemed. Is temporary freedom truly a reward, or just a new kind of prison? The end of beauty, the shelf life of sorrow. The Xianggong were cursed with the opposite of good fortune. The timing of their beauty was predetermined, and their decline was a matter of simple arithmetic. The shelf life of their profitability was crushingly short, typically ending between the ages of 20 and 25. The system demanded perpetual youth. Once a young man began to lose the soft, delicate features of adolescence, once his voice deepened, or the initial lines of exhaustion appeared, his value began a rapid, irreversible descent. The Yi had no patience for aging assets. They were quickly and brutally demoted. The expensive robes and makeup were reassigned to the younger, newer arrivals. The opera performances ceased. The pattern of demotion was severe. The formerly honorable gentleman was relegated to menial work within the house, cleaning, assisting the kitchen staff, or serving as an enforcer for the younger boys, a grim irony for a man who had once faced the whip himself. The fall from grace was total, public, and psychologically shattering. Many could not bear the loss of status, often leading to reliance on highly addictive substances to dull the pain. For those who were physically expelled, the prospects were bleak. They carried the indelible stigma of their past, making it impossible to integrate into legitimate society. They were viewed as tainted goods, lacking the skills for conventional labor, as they had been trained only in the arts of refinement and performance. They were forced onto the streets, performing low-level labor, or subsisting through desperate, low-wage employment, often living their final years in anonymity and distress. Their earlier fame utterly forgotten. This phase of their lives was the system's final, brutal act of disposal. The elegant, celebrated life was extinguished, leaving behind a husk of the man who once recited poetry for high officials. The entire structure of the brothel was designed to exploit the brief window of their youthful beauty and then discard the spent resources without ceremony. The tragic pattern repeated itself endlessly. A celebrated ascent, followed by a devastating, anonymous conclusion. Before we reveal the final, chilling pattern of silence, if these untold stories matter to you, share this video with someone who needs to hear the forgotten stories of the past. It helps these narratives see the light. The cosmic punchline, a legacy of silence. The fall of the Qing dynasty's Xianggong system is haunted by a phenomenon far more chilling than their individual fates, the pattern of historical silence. The end of this unique form of exploitation left behind an absence, a historical echo that feels like a deliberate cultural erasure. When the Qing dynasty finally collapsed, the practice slowly withered under the pressure of Western influence. But the closing of the brothels did not bring redemption, it brought erasure. There were no grand records of those who endured this life, no detailed official histories of their trauma. Their suffering was considered too illicit, too shameful, or simply too minor to be recorded by the official brush. The number that haunts their legacy is not 17, but 0. 0 records of the psychological cost. 0 acknowledgement of their contributions to the art and culture of the time. 0 monuments or memorials to their sacrifice. The men who bought them went on to become celebrated officials and poets. The young men who served them were left with nothing but the scars on their bodies and the shame on their names. This silence is the cosmic punchline. The system of high-level exploitation ensured that the victims, the young men, were disposable, both in life and in history. The sheer specificity of their story, the elegant title, the artistic training, the financial trap created a pattern that ensures their trauma remains a footnote, a secret whispered in the margins of historical texts. Skeptics correctly point out that with enough data points, you can find patterns anywhere, but the sheer volume of silence surrounding the Xiang Gong feels different. The brutal, structured exploitation of these young, marginalized individuals is a historical pattern so strong, it suggests that sometimes history doesn't just rhyme. It repeats the mechanisms of power and silence itself word for word, only under different labels and in different centuries. The fate of the honorable gentleman is a solemn reminder that the most profound tragedies are the ones the official world chooses to forget. And yet, history left one single, chilling footprint, a faded ledger entry in the Qing archives recording the purchase of a 14-year-old boy named Liang. His entire existence, the poetry, the silks, the suffering, is distilled into one single, crossed-out line of silver. That single line is the only grave marker for 6,000 lost souls. The silence is not history forgetting, it is history erasing its crime. Comment below, what other overlooked historical patterns do you think deserve to be brought into the light? If the shadows of history and the stark precision of cosmic coincidence intrigue you, make sure to subscribe right now and give this video a like. Your engagement ensures we continue to uncover the truths history tried to bury.